Good morning, everyone. Welcome. You got it? So my name is Christine Tucci Osorio. I am the superintendent for District 622, North St. Paul, Maplewood, and Oakdale.
And I'm Paula Forbes from Forbes Solutions, a law firm in Minneapolis and St. Paul.
On behalf of the Minneapolis Foundation and all of our hosts this morning, we want to thank you all for being here. We actually have a request. If we could, I know all of our superintendent colleagues are going to go, what? We want to actually invite all of our superintendent colleagues to come up here for just a moment and just introduce ourselves. So if you're a superintendent in the house, if you could just come up here for a moment.
Come on up, please.
We have a request just to find out superintendents that are here, if you could come on up on stage for a moment and introduce yourselves. We want to be able to just show which school district leaders are here today and just say a quick hello. All we need to know is kind of your name, which district you represent, and help all our guests know who all's here today.
Hi, Terry. See you.
We'll just get in a line and just pass the mic down. Perfect. All right, we'll start right down there with Terry.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Terry Stallo, and I'm the superintendent at Prior Lake Savage Area Schools. Welcome.
Good morning, Aston Osai, Superintendent, St. Louis Park Public Schools.
Steve Yanowski, Superintendent, Richfield Public Schools.
Peter Olsenskog, West St. Paul, Mendota Heights, and Egan area schools.
Also, I'd like to add my welcome. Dennis Peterson, Superintendent, Minnetonka.
Renee Cornet, St. Anthony New Brighton Schools.
Mary Krieger, Rosemont, Apple Valley, Egan.
Good morning, Teresa Battle, Burnsville, Egan, Savage, District 191.
Good morning, I'm Dave Webb, South St. Paul Schools.
Good morning, Josh Swanson, Superintendent, Eden Prairie Schools.
Dave Bernardson, Inver Grove Heights.
Good morning, Chase Anderson, Wayzata Schools.
Good morning, Joe Gothard, St. Paul Public Schools.
Good morning, Mike Redmond, Shakopee Public Schools.
Good morning, Corey McIntyre, Osseo Area Schools.
Thank you. All right. Thank you all for coming up. We are glad you're all here this morning.
I'm really honored to share the stage with all of these superintendents. They really represent Reimagine Minnesota and the education work. This started because of them, and it started back in November of 2015. I received a call from John Schultz, then superintendent of Hopkins School District. He's now the superintendent of Edina School District. And John called me and he said, hey, Paula, there's this lawsuit that was just recently filed. Do you know about it? And I said, yes, I do. He said it's called Alejandro Cruz Guzman, and it's alleging that the school districts are segregated. And as a result of that segregation, it's alleging that we are in violation of the Minnesota Education Clause, that we are not adequately giving kids of color and kids in poverty a good, excellent education, and that we are depriving them of their constitutional right of access and opportunity to education. And he said, we need to talk about that. What can we do? So he convened a number of superintendents, a number of attorneys in town, and other scholars to talk about what we need to do. And we had conversations over several months. The superintendents could have done several things. They could have taken no action and allowed the lawsuit just to proceed and carry forward. It's still going on today, by the way. They could have intervened in the lawsuit and taken a position. But what they decided to do was the road less taken. They decided to look at the data and acknowledge that not all kids were receiving an excellent education according to the Constitution. And they decided that they needed to find a way to make that happen. So they ventured out to speak with the community. I am honored that they asked me to help facilitate those conversations in the community. And sometimes it is with the most uncomfortable conversations that you have that courageous opportunity to find the answers that you need. The superintendents did that over 12 convenings through the Metropolitan Area School District schools. They spoke with 3,000 participants. They held a student conference of 300 students, and a business leader luncheon. And they gathered 10,000 data points. We had the wonderful Ann Gomez with us the whole journey. She's over there doing the journey today in a visual harvesting. And we also utilized Youth Lens 360, Dario Otero, who's sitting in front of us. Dario brought the youth with him. And he was the one that forged the path and said, if you don't have youth voice, you will not get the answers that you need. And so he utilized the youth. Thank you, Dario. He utilized the youth in the process, and they have been with us all along, and they're here today. They're going to speak to us today, so that's terrific. But what they came up with was an education plan, and with the help of another facilitator, Mara Hansen, who is incredible, they, as David Webb would say, got past that goal line and created the education plan. So I want to pass it over to Christine to talk about what we've done since 2015.
Wonderful, thank you, Paula. So since 2015, and I'll just say as a superintendent, as a member district, as part of those 12 convenings, that World Cafe experience was amazing. We worked collaboratively across district lines to work together under Paula's leadership and Dario's leadership. Since that time, all of the information that was collected got synthesized down into basically 9 buckets, 9 strategies that came about from those community voices. When we had the findings from that roadmap that was put together, our strategies that came about Reimagine Minnesota, we got together as superintendents and decided, well, what are we going to do with this information? And we have since continued meeting. We've been having workshops, we've been having monthly conversations, and we've continued to meet as a group. And mind you, this is our AMSD school district, so all of the districts across the metropolitan area have continued to have regular conversations. We've had strategy conferences, we've had under those 9 categories, and you can see the 9 categories right across your tables. Those tents on your tables actually are those categories right there in front of you. We've continued to meet, sometimes in large conferences, workshops that we pulled together. We've pulled together our members of our cabinet, different people inside of our school districts to focus on specific areas, recruiting and retaining diverse staff. We brought together our HR folks to have planning meetings around that. Hiring. We've had meetings that are specific around personalized learning and instructional practices and bringing cultural competency to our teaching. Sometimes we also, and we're continuing to this day, having meetings that are just among our superintendent group. And I'll tell you something that's been pretty incredible. We are really having honest conversations with each other. I still cannot believe that several years later, we're still at the table talking. I can't think of a place across the United States where you would see an entire metropolitan area getting together and having these kinds of conversations together. The power in that is amazing, and I'll tell you, we have had real challenging experiences amongst each other. We've had pushback, we've had fights with each other, we've had arguments, we have had tears, we've had really deep conversations, and I say sometimes, a new member joined our group recently and was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? I said, don't worry, this is how we talk to each other. This is how we get things done. But I think there's something to be said about the fact that we continue to come together. And something I think we have to really ask ourselves is, if we really, really believe in public education and really saving public education, we have to come together and stay engaged, because it would be so easy to walk away from this table and say, okay, we did that a few years ago, let's move on, what's the next thing gonna be? We haven't done that. We keep coming back to the table and we keep saying, okay, we gotta go deeper with these conversations. We gotta take this work to the next level. And that is what today is all about. We have continued to stay engaged, and right now we're trying to engage a much broader audience and take our work to a whole nother level. And I'm very excited that we have this opportunity to broaden our connections today. And we're just so grateful that you're all here to help us do that, and thrilled to see where this collaboration can go next when we all put ourselves in the room together and start working together for our students. Thank you.
One of the wonderful things that we were able to do this fall through the generosity of the Minneapolis Foundation, Patrice Relafit, passionate about equity, and R.T. Ryback, CEO, was have a student conference. And through that student conference, we had 1,500 students come right down here to this level at the Minneapolis Convention Center and talk about what the perfect ideal school district should look like in 2030. They knew the parameters: equity, excellence, access and opportunity, and an integrated school district that was creating equality for all kids. And they wrestled with that. Right now, we are in the midst of synthesizing all of that data, and you're going to see videos today of some of that work. But I want to again thank everybody that participated in that conference and everybody that hosted and sponsored and supported the work. So thank you so much.
I feel like a big idea that's been circulating in my head for like the past 3 years is I feel like all teachers should take like a psychology class to understand, because to understand how the brain works would be a better way of actually like teaching. You can't teach like somebody if you don't understand how their brain works, you know? I feel that all teachers and students alike should respect that each one of them is an individual, therefore their brain could work completely different from the person standing next to you. So I believe to make it like equitable is that you understand that, well, yeah, we're all different, you respect that, you can try to understand, and then you just teach them the best way they see possible. Some people need structure, some people don't, you know. It's just all about the next person.
Good morning, I'm R.T. Ryback from the Minneapolis Foundation, and it's an incredible, incredible honor to be here today as the Minneapolis Foundation with the Greater Twin Cities United Way, with the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation stand together here with the superintendents and the students. And it would be very, very easy and probably a great temptation to start today with some of those searing statistics that so many of the people in this room understand all too well. The statistics that show the enormous gaps in our schools that break along racial lines. Those gaps that illustrate for us that there is almost no community in the United States of America where it is more likely you can look at two kids in a classroom and predict the likelihood of their success by looking at the color of their skin. We know what is wrong, and it should be searing, and it should stay with us, but I am not going to start there today. I'm going to start today with something that's a little unusual for those of us who've been banging our heads against the wall on this for a long time, and it's a glimmer of hope. And the glimmer of hope connects back to what you just heard and saw with all those superintendents standing together. And I want you to think about a Friday afternoon, and you're a superintendent. Throughout that entire week, you have gone through, you can only imagine, in the classroom, in the counselor's office, with the training for safety that you have to do. And just imagine everything on a superintendent's shoulders, and it's Friday, and they get in their car and they can't wait to get home. And they get into rush hour traffic, but they don't go home. You know where they went? They drove all across town, from all across the metropolitan area. Not just one of them. Almost every single superintendent drove to one place and together talked more about schools. And they really, as you just heard, put their hearts and their heads on the line. And what they did is they found common ground among them. This is extraordinarily rare. We have not seen this in this community. And they laid out a strategy. But you know what is even more powerful than that? Before they started that work, they turned to the communities they served, the families and the students, and they said, what do you think we ought to do? And they took that knowledge from the students in the community, and then they took that knowledge that they all have together, and they came together on a report and a strategy. And about that time, the Attorney General called me up and said, you know what? When I was a congressman and you were a mayor, we used to say we got to do more to fight education equity, and I'm now the top legal officer for the state of Minnesota, and I don't want to defend a lawsuit as the state's top legal officer that somehow says we're doing a great job because we ain't. And he was right. And that led to a series of things where we, in partnership with the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundations and the United Way, took this report and said, we've got to elevate this and bring this out to more people. And we have to do something that'll help those superintendents also bring in even more knowledge and even more expertise. And having run Generation Next before this, I had the great privilege of working with all of the teams of the University of Minnesota, an amazing resource that we have not tapped anywhere nearly enough. And the person who's been the lead at the University of Minnesota on education equity, you will hear from in a minute, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, who is one of the most respected researchers in education in the country and someone who I believe is an incredible homegrown community resource here. We turned to Dr. Rodriguez and said, put together a team of great experts at the university. We didn't say, give us whatever ideas you over at the university think. Those are important. We said something different. We said, take this report, take those views of the students and the families and the superintendents, and now make it deeper. Take those areas they identified, 8 different areas, and the university added one other tool on, which is implementation science, which is simply saying, how do we make sure that we not only have these brilliant ideas, but that they work at scale across areas? Dr. Rodriguez is going to give us an outline of all of that. But I hope everybody in this room recognizes that it won't stop there. Because today, after we hear that, every one of you is going to be asked to be part of this continuous series of feedback loops. We're going to ask your opinion. We're going to ask you to work on the issues that matter most to you, but we will not stop here. In this room, our superintendents, our school board members, our legislators, our people from philanthropy, our donors, our students, our people who are deeply engaged in the community in different ways, and we want to keep this coalition together because the fact of the matter is, as we've looked at education, and especially education equity in this community, there has been a lot of good intention, but there has been a whole lot of people at the schools saying, why don't people listen to us? And communities saying, why don't they listen to us? And people from outside of those schools saying, why won't they take our help? Well, now we have a moment, an incredible moment, and this is a unique moment in which we have the opportunity to work together to address the single most important issue that is going to either make or break this community. You are here for a reason. It is a gift to be here together. And before hearing from Dr. Rodriguez and before those workshops, we want you to hear from the students again.
There are a lot of issues, you know. So yeah, I feel like people are glad that we're finally kind of taking charge as our Generation Z. I really thought that it was going to be like, we kind of walk in, we all give our opinions and then just kind of dip, but I felt really welcomed, really, like we had a purpose.
In the conversations, I heard a lot about like more equity, more equality, about like resources in school and seeing more diverse staff and seeing a difference in the school system.
It's so diverse here. I'm really connected with all the people. The music's good, you know. I'm glad we're finally addressing this issue.
There just like needs to be like training sessions for teachers or like safe space for kids to go, or just it needs to be like more publicized so students are able to get the help that they need.
Yeah, I definitely think that personal relationship, that personal connection with your teacher would really relieve the stress, because like, say you got something going on at home and you don't have enough time to do your homework and you just come to school and not done. But if you have that personal connection with your teacher, they'll understand, so they'll make a plan for you to be more successful.
Hi, everybody. My name is Shavarius Coney Harwell. Wow, there's a lot of you. I was actually a part of one of the smaller teams of planning the student conference, and it's just amazing to see how it all came together and how many people showed up. Like, that was pretty cool. Started in like a little cool space, very colorful. Bunch of people. Like, I was very nervous, kind of nervous too. But one of the issues that I wanted to talk about, more of like an opinion, is that I believe that a lot of like the teachers and staff at schools should actually take a cultural knowledge class. And I don't really know how that would go about, but I feel that it would be very important that to make it like more safe and comfortable environment for students, teachers, and staff alike, if we all kind of know where we come from and how certain words may affect us, or just gestures even, and how maybe even a piece of clothing could be important to us, and you just gotta put that into perspective. I also believe that maybe even just open space technology should be used a lot more in classrooms. I know personally, when I look at Central, I mean, it was designed by an architect who also worked on prisons. Like, it's not very inviting or comfortable, am I right? Like, so I don't really want to walk in there every day and learn when it feels like I'm going to a federal prison. You know, I believe that spaces should be more open, a lot more sunlight, even more like agriculturally friendly, have trees, bushes, more vibrant colors, because the color spectrum is very important to the brain. I mean, just warm, bright colors that invite learning and more comfortable just mindsets. And had an itch. I also believe that we could just have schools actually partner with organizations and groups that help for the homeless and even food, because I know a lot of kids, their situations at home aren't the most friendly or inviting, and I know I would be very discouraged to go to school if I just got kicked out of my house, or my mother couldn't pay the rent and now I don't know what I'm gonna do. You know, school isn't my top priority, survival is. So I think it'd be very nice if schools actually helped kids in that environment, in just that situation, you know, like food. I don't know if food shelters, if that would be a way of doing it, or just having snack bars, or even just somebody to sit down and talk to that could actually hook me up with some places to go to if I was in that situation. I don't know if I'm over the time limit, but another thing that I touched on briefly in the video was that I believe that teachers and staff should take a psychology class, because I strongly believe that you can't really teach the mind if you don't understand or comprehend how that mind works, especially in adolescents and adults. So it'd be very important that if you took a course, I don't know how many months or weeks it would take, but you know, just to get that thought process, and you can kind of look at things differently. Like, maybe this student's acting out because they have ADHD and it's very hard for them to sit in that really hard plastic chair, or maybe this kid has autism and you don't pick up those signs because you don't really know. So I just believe that'd be cool to have. That's it? Okay, on to the next person.
Good morning, my name is Rabia Abdi, and the message I want to send to the superintendents in this classroom today is that we need to do more to support the students on the lower half of the achievement gap. I would like to see more resources to benefit students like me, really. I want to see, I don't just want to see health and wellness classes only for 6 weeks inside one classroom. I want to see what we learn in around the school campus. And yeah, that's the message I want to send. I think teachers need to be trained better to understand why certain students do certain behaviors. I don't really think that teachers understand the different struggles teenagers go through today, and it just makes it hard to have a bond with someone who's, you know, teaching you, who's like, they're kind of like your parent, really. They're teaching you things that you need to, you know, do better in life and kind of excel. So I don't really think it's worth having those classes if, you know, we don't do anything after those 12 weeks are up. And I don't really think it's beneficial to have teachers who don't understand you.
Hi, and wow, there are a lot of you. Okay, I'm Anishka, and first a little bit of a background about the student conference. Beyond what you already know, we did talk about a lot of other topics ranging from AP classes to art and wellness and physical education and how technology is integrated. And basically there were breakout sessions for every single topic. So it wasn't just touching on disparities in funding or even just, diversity gaps. It was an extremely all-encompassing aspect of how education is currently structured. And while Yash and I weren't there for all the sessions because we only hosted one of them, we did sit in on a lot of sessions, and what the primary takeaway there was that there are a lot of disparities even within specific districts, and even if we were to legislate something that does help all of education policy in the state, it needs to be specific to the schooling system and it needs to be specific to the district because the needs are different across the board. I go to Edina High School, so I'm always fortunate enough to not have to worry about lack in access because we're literally just thrown a bunch of access all the time, but that isn't the case with a lot of schools in Minnesota. And there's especially disparities when it comes to things that aren't considered in today's day and age, like technology disparities, which is not an issue that we necessarily think about, but it's also extremely important in closing the education gap, because technology is currently being used to help high schoolers gain better access to education and better platforms for their learning abilities and all of that. So.
So, is this, okay. So I'm from Edina as well, and myself, along with other members of my school's Mosaic group, which bolsters diversity and inclusion across the district, specifically facilitated discussion on geography. And we heard many different things from students from districts like Apple Valley, Eagan, and Eden Prairie. And they told us about how even within the district, school lines and funding can create many different demographic differences between schools and the inherent tensions that creates. So they described how because one school might be, it had richer students or it had whiter students, other strong or wealthy students would also want to go there, and that perpetuated differences to the point where the differences between the schools were simply unacceptable. And in particular, we were inspired by a discussion of how the Eden Prairie School Board made a brave decision to create a new transportation plan to even out demographic discrepancies between their different elementary schools, and how even though there was harsh opposition, they were able to take that action, and I found that really inspiring. Further, I think there was a general consensus that we really appreciate being heard by people in power and people who are making these decisions, but most importantly, it's really appreciated if even after listening to these voices, we as an education system are able to take the extra step to actually implement these programs. Thank you.
From a young age that we aren't taught about different cultures, because that's where things like racism and microaggressions come from, because we're not being taught from kindergarten that not only equality is something we should be striving for, but something we should be living in the present. So I think that by starting education of cultures and that idea of equity at a really young age, and by telling people of minority stories, that's a step forward in making sure that moving forward that there's going to be equality in all planes.
Am I okay? Oh, there I am. Good. I never write out what I'm about to say, and I've been thinking about this for weeks, and finally last night, I decided these people really deserve something, so I had to write it out last night. I sat down, wrote it all out. In March this year, RT came to us, myself and Julie Schweitzer, my partner at the Educational Equity Resource Center, and made the pitch that you heard earlier. And who can say no to RT? He's come to me a number of times, and I'm busier than ever, and I really appreciate the invitations. We have a number of faculty from the University of Minnesota here, a number that have worked on this particular project, and some of our colleagues. So please, I want you to stand up. I want to make sure that we recognize you and appreciate the input and the contribution. These are Minnesota resources, and RT is continually reminding me about that. Julie and I identified a group of faculty and researchers in 6 different units from across the College of Education and Human Development who have devoted their careers, scholarship, and service to addressing educational equity. We also identified individuals who are currently working in schools and working with communities. These are engaged scholars. When we sent out the invitation to participate in this project over the summer, they didn't hesitate. And of course, they said, we will contribute. And the report was generated by a diverse group. We are listed at the end of the report. And when we sat down and we saw each other and we acknowledged this, this unique combination of research, scholarship, engagement, and diversity, the profile of the folks that wrote this particular report that is really augmenting the work of superintendents in their communities was really valuable. So I really appreciate this opportunity to elevate this work and to really elevate the work of the communities and superintendents behind Reimagine Minnesota. The report, however, is not the end-all dissertation on how to address educational equity. It is a reflection of a particular group of engaged scholars, and in some cases, we're not just expanding or deepening the effort, we've added to it a little bit. You've heard a little bit of that. We've taken on areas of particular challenge and areas of promise. And it includes at least 2 new areas. One is this area that crosses the pathways and the roadmap, the social and emotional context of learning, and then also the principles of implementation science. I'm going to come back to those. I love my job. And it's not just a professional commitment, but it's a personal one. And so RT suggested that I was going to give you a bit of an outline of the report, and I'm going to do that by doing a little personal reflection. Because as I read through the report, I saw myself and my own pathways in much of this report. I still have to pinch myself and do a reality check. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota. Me, a rugrat from the Lower East Side of St. Paul. All the statistics and prediction models suggest I shouldn't be here. The kids I grew up with are not my colleagues at the University of Minnesota. Many of them are no longer here. I grew up in a house a block off of Payne Avenue. The quintessential East Side home. 4 generations in my household. Myself, my brothers, my mother, my uncle, my grandparents, my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother who was born here in Minnesota. Makes me a 5th-generation Minnesotan, 4th-generation resident of the great city of St. Paul. And we were so East Side. My grandfather worked for the Hams Brewery. My grandmother worked for the Tony Company. People know the Tony Company, which was purchased by Gillette. My mother worked for Whirlpool over on Arcade. It was a true labor union household. There was this loosely organized network of after-school activities. People who tried to keep us rugrats occupied after school. We would stop at the Wilder Playground on the way home. We would go bowling at the YMCA on Arcade for a dime. We would hang out at the Salvation Army on Payne Avenue. And the Salvation Army was the best. They took us on fishing trips, trips downtown to the Science Museum, and yes, every once in a while we'd sit in a circle and sing Kumbaya. My guess is that this system of youth programs was largely unorganized, but together they connected us, and they connected to each one of us in a slightly different way. For some, it was the fishing trips. For others, it was the trips to the Science Museum. And for some, it was those Kumbaya moments. Somehow, this network had us. They had our minds, our bodies, and our spirits. They recognized us as whole people. And I can say, if it wasn't for this loosely organized network of schools and after-school partners, I clearly wouldn't be here today. I also have to attribute my presence here today to schools. I grew up in St. Paul schools, single mother, in and out of my grandparents' home, different school every year. I went to 6 different elementary schools in St. Paul. Thus the model suggests I shouldn't be here. Went to Maplewood Junior High, became a Mustang. Go Maplewood Mustangs. And then ventured a little further out to Woodbury for high school. And Woodbury was really transformative to me because for the first time I entered an environment where everybody was kind of on the same page. It was just a simple expectation we were all going to college. 5th generation Minnesotan, none of my family had been in college. And at Woodbury, I was the only Latino in my grade. There was one other in a grade older than mine. And by the way, there was only one black student in my grade. And to be able to spend time with friends after school, we would do homework first. Who could imagine doing homework with friends? In my junior year, the counselor set me down, college books in front of me, and said, "Where do you want to go?" I had no idea what he was up to. But it was clear to me that all of my friends were thinking about where they want to go. And this conversation started, a conversation I've never had. I even went to a summer science camp. So that's what they did. They went to summer academic camps in Storm Lake, Iowa, Buena Vista College. And the only reason I went is because my science teacher gave me an application, said, "You need to fill this out." Senior year came. Once again, the counselor said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, University of Minnesota? I had no idea. Actually, I did know something about the University of Minnesota, and I knew it was a place to get answers. Because throughout my childhood, my mother regularly called the University of Minnesota. I'd be sitting at the kitchen table after school eating my cookies and milk, and my mother would be on the phone. "My son has a rash on his arm. I'm wondering if calamine lotion will do the job." Another time she'll call the university. "I have this really weird plant growing in my garden, and I'm wondering if I should be worried about it. Is it an invasive weed?" Another question. "What kind of salt is the best for canning pickles?" And one time, I even remember this so specifically, she called the University of Minnesota and said, "I'm taking my kids up north to the cabin this weekend. Are we going to face snow on the way home on Sunday?" And so to me, the University of Minnesota was the place with answers. It was my mother's Google. So when my counselor said, "Where do you want to go?" University of Minnesota, duh. There was no other option for me. These stories are not just taking up my time up here in front of you all. They are reflections on how educational systems may or may not meet the needs of our children and communities. They reflect practices that are equitable and effective because educators make an explicit effort to know students, families, and communities, to set high expectations uniformly, but then be able to back them up with resources and supports. It's not rocket science. With a family in Minnesota since the late 1800s, I have a difficult time going anywhere without running into some family or friends. I was downtown St. Paul for a meeting with a colleague. I think it was Scott McConnell. He's a colleague of ours in special ed. And I ran into a cousin. And the cousin runs up to me and says, "Hey, it's so good to see you. I just ran into your grandmother last week. And she says, she's so proud of you. You're doing such great work in rocket science at the University of Minnesota." And Scott quickly jumped in and said, "Yes, he is. Yes, he is." I am not a rocket scientist, okay? What I am is a word I don't often say. I'm a psychometrician, and I don't use that word at the dinner table at Thanksgiving. I'm an educational measurement specialist, and I do research and train others in state-of-the-art measurement methods and focus on assessment literacy and that is how to use assessment information in ways that are meaningful, appropriate, and useful. One of the biggest dangers we have in Minnesota and across the nation is that we continue to use our state tests to define our vision of learning. We cannot allow the state test to define our vision of learning. But state tests play an important role. They are an important barometer, but they're just an indicator. They're one indicator. There's so much else to quality schools, quality education, quality programming. State tests are not designed to be diagnostic or instructionally informative. They are indicators of the success of the system, not the success of our students. I know that we can create assessment activities that engage all students in the subject matter, because I do some of this work. We can create assessments that acknowledge traditional and local ways of knowing and ways of doing. We can connect knowledge and skill that children bring into our classrooms to the subject matter, to disciplinary ways of knowing and doing. Mathematical, scientific, historical, literary ways of knowing and doing can be explored in traditional and culturally relevant ways. In fact, they already are. It's just that the traditional and cultural bases for many disciplinary knowledge and practice frameworks are based on a privileged majority cultural perspective. And we have some examples of how these kinds of practices are currently taking place in schools in Minnesota. I'm going to give you a few examples. Anishinaabe Academy in Minneapolis. We have some Minneapolis folks here. Anishinaabe is a place where children regularly experience trauma. And when there's one trauma in a family, the entire school and community feels it. The teachers struggle there to try to figure out how to make academic subject matter relevant in such a challenging environment. So they've explored the use of themes that are grounded in indigenous traditions in the community. One theme that they use is ricing. Now, many of you probably know Minnesota has a long tradition around wild rice, and many of the students in Anishinaabe have probably never riced, maybe some, but they know the stories, and they know that it's relevant, and they know it's part of who they are. And just think about ricing. It involves mathematics, science, history. It provides many opportunities for reading and writing and storytelling. Indigenous ways of knowing and doing can be utilized and protected in the disciplinary ways of knowing and doing that are targeted by the state's academic standards. Students should never leave class being reminded that their experiences are irrelevant. Students often get the clearest message about what's important in a subject matter by what shows up on the test. So we have to be really careful about what we put on that test. Many of the other practices and frameworks addressed in the report are seen in other schools. Is Northfield here? Northfield. Next week in Northfield, they will have trained a group of student leaders to understand the data that are available to the schools, the academic data, student behavior data, data from the Minnesota Student Survey. These students then will lead a student data summit where students will review the data, talk about the conditions that exist underneath the data, and develop action steps in response to their reviews. This is a strong example of elevating student voice, not just to listen to what students have to say, but to engage students as partners. Because who better can help us understand data than the source? St. Paul, Minneapolis, St. Cloud, Sartell, St. Stephen, Sauk Rapids, Rice, Bloomington, Edina, Lakeville, Orono, Wayzata, West St. Paul, Mendota Heights, Eagan, Princeton, Anoka Hennepin, Hopkins, Osseo, and many others are doing deep dives into social and emotional learning assessment data, partially from the Minnesota Student Survey, but also from surveys that are generated locally. These data contain student voice, and we need to do a better job of listening and engaging. These schools explicitly acknowledge that students are young people not only developing cognitively, which is really what we focus on in schools, cognitive development, but our young people are developing socially, personally, culturally. They're developing personal identities. Cognitive and identity development co-occur. They are intertwined. And we cannot ignore one if we hope to be successful with the other. Richfield Schools is experimenting with ways to engage families in science programming. Students, families, and teachers are learning from each other. Is Richfield's here? I know I saw a few. A handful of schools also across the state are doing equity audits. And they're exploring the role of leadership in supporting and creating an appropriate and supportive climate in schools. But I have to be honest with you. Some schools do equity audits, and those audits go in a file drawer. It's not enough to do an equity audit. We have to create an engagement team around it. RT talked a little bit about implementation science. We need to manage our work. It has to be actively managed. In the report, we talk a little bit about an implementation team. And that team has to be realistic, and it has to engage the key partners who make this work happen. Our school leaders, staff, our students, families, and communities. That team has to actively manage our work. I was asked to do a brief introduction to the report, to review a key points. You should read the report, reflect on how it speaks to the work in your schools and communities, but also acknowledge that schools cannot do this work alone. It mystifies me why we only hold the Department of Education accountable for school outcomes, educational outcomes in Minnesota. Why not landlords and housing authorities? Stable housing has a direct impact on educational outcomes. Why not the Department of Transportation? Since we know that in the Twin Cities, the majority of chronic absenteeism is due to limited transportation. Instead, we criminalize parents because their children miss the bus and can't get to school. What about the Department of Employment and Economic Development? Health and Human Services, Public Safety and Corrections. All state agencies in Minnesota, in some way, engage in public policy making and programming that either supports or undermines educational outcomes. And then there's us at the University of Minnesota. Those of us that are engaged in this work through our scholarship, teaching, and outreach. Quite frankly, not all of us are. And I'm kind of glad, because we need people to do the real basic research, to just focus and get it done. And then we need those translational researchers to promote that work, to practice, and to engage in our communities and scholarships. But I often wonder, why is the university not the first place you call when you have a question? My mother did. We are happy to be here, to be engaged in this work. We take seriously the land-grant mission of the University of Minnesota, your resource. Call on us. We have multiple avenues. This sort of loosely organized Educational Equity Resource Center. We have a new venture underway in the College of Education and Human Development called Educational Technology Innovations. And they're there to help us because they recognize that researchers will do a research project and get new questions and then seek research to answer the new questions and move on to the next project and on and on. And we don't often think, how are we getting this work out into the hands of the folks that could really use it? So this office is trying to help us. And some of you know some of the products that are now being provided. Press, Check and Connect, Ramp Up to Readiness. Many of these are in schools across Minnesota. But our work only matters to the extent that you all find it useful. So we need to have this conversation. We need to manage this work actively. And that's what we're here to start today. And I shouldn't really say start because, as I mentioned, a whole series of examples, this work is actually underway. And we need to hear about that and learn from each other. If some of you are available next week, you should call Northfield and find out when they're doing that data summit. I wish I could be there, but I have commitments at the university that I couldn't get away from. But I would love to see that, what students make of the data. So I appreciate the time and your attention. Now we got a little bit of work to do.
My name is David. I go to Anoka High School, and we had a class. It was an AP African American class, and it was like 90% African American people with like 3 white or different culture students, and it was taught by a black teacher, and that's one of the best classes I've ever taken in my life because he related to us so much. It was so easy for him to teach it to us, and almost like everyone passed with the A because of how like easy it was to understand and how like nice it was. And my question is, why can't we have more classes adapted that are advanced placement for Mexican, Asian, just whoever? Because you cannot look at me like with a straight face and tell me there's no Asian teachers, there's no Mexican teachers that we can't hire and like be a history teacher. Okay.
Wherever you would like. Hello, Dr. Jenkins. Hello, Dr. Schultz. Thank you. I'm Dr. Eric Jolly, the president and CEO of the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundations, a lifelong educator and science education advocate, and it is my pleasure to welcome not just this panel, but all of you here today. One first step towards justice is the courageous recognition of injustice. The superintendents and the 3,000 partners, the teachers, the students, and all of you are a part of that first step. We are recognizing the injustice, and when you read this report, it is clear that where we need to find the fix is not by fixing the students, but by changing the patterns of the adults who help nurture and grow those students. So we have the first step. We have recognized the injustice. The next question is, how will we act to fix it? And today we are blessed with a panel that helped build this report, and I'm pleased to introduce them. Dr. John Schultz is the superintendent of Edina Public School District since 2017. He has been a middle school science teacher and associate principal at Eden Prairie. He's also taught science education and elementary teaching methods at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Schultz earned a master's degree in soil, water, and climate science and a PhD in curriculum and instruction from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Carlton Jenkins has served as superintendent of the Robbinsdale area district school since 2015. And Dr. Jenkins came to Robbinsdale from the Atlanta Public Schools, where he served as the chief academic officer. He's also previously been superintendent of Saginaw Public Schools in Michigan, and has led multiple education programs across the Midwest, starting as Beloit Public Schools in Wisconsin as a high school principal. Dr. Jenkins began his career in Beloit in the late 80s. He earned a master's degree in educational administration and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Schultz, Dr. Jenkins, you've had a chance to read this report. You helped build the Reimagine report. Do you have a question for Dr. Rodriguez or a reaction that you'd like to share as we get started? And I think you may be seated upon a microphone somewhere. If not, we'll pass one down. You're seated upon there. I stole yours. Oh, you stole it.
Testing. Should I start?
Yes.
So, Dr. Rodriguez, throughout the report, there's an emphasis on student agency and student voice. and you also mentioned that in your remarks. This is central to the discussions the superintendents had when they were developing the Reimagine Minnesota recommendations. And we all believe in education that through this we can build trust with students, especially for those students who have been alienated from their school experiences. The report suggests that students be given the opportunity to imagine, to hypothesize, investigate, and really having students partner in co-constructing knowledge in learning. So I believe many teachers do this, and many want to make this more central in their work. So my question lies in the current climate of testing and measurement. In the work of measuring achievement against academic standards, what guidance can you give school districts who want to co-construct their learning experiences with students' voice and agency, but are still required to put in place and assess achievement against state standards?
My real interest in assessment is classroom assessment, the kinds of assessment activities that teachers create for their students within the classroom, because that is the most intimate dialogue about a subject matter that teachers engage in with students. And when those assessments allow students to bring in their own experiences and relevance to the subject matter, that's where students really flourish. Kids are scientists, naturally. They are engaged in trial and error on a regular basis. They're experimenting all the time, right? We should capture and harness that. There are lots of examples of how to make the work of a subject matter specialist, a teacher, relevant and engaging for students. I'll give you a quick science example. We can ask students to go take pictures in their home and community about how they keep their family and community safe. Those pictures can be brought in, and we can explore around microbes and microbiology, the science of how we keep our families and communities safe. Thus, just doing a really simple connection with something that matters and something that's relevant, but perhaps something that's unique to each student. Students should be partners, and I mentioned this earlier. When I talk with schools around educational equity, one of the first questions I ask is, have you talked with your students? And I think we can do much, much more of that, and not just talk and listen, but elevate their presence as partners.
Dr. Jenkins, do you have a response or question?
Yes, a question really, first of all, let me just say I am very pleased to be here, and Dr. Rodriguez to be here, and knowing you as a scholar is just really exciting for me to be here. But it should not be, even in any conference, that we recognize Dr. Rodriguez as an exception to the rule. And this is where we have to start this conversation. When is it going to get to the point when we come out, it is because the way we should be, not an exception. There's nothing exceptional about myself or Dr. Rodriguez. But having read through the report and having participated in Reimagine Minnesota's work and looking at the strategies that we put forth, and then looking at the recent development of Cruz Guzman and some of the remedies posed there by the plaintiffs, I am wanting to know from yourself, how do you think this aligns with the Green 6 conditions, which we all know, and as we said here, this work that we're doing now didn't just start. And we can go back to Brown versus the board, but after Brown versus the board, the Green 6, which stands out as the gold standard for segregation and what should be done. So how do you see these three pillars coming together, this report, Reimagine, and then also what we have in the Cruz Guzman?
So this, I mean, wow. That is really bringing it all together. And that's a really good question for the tables and for all of us. We should all take that question back and address that actively. You're right, this story has been told for decades. And one of the real challenges, though, is that our communities are continually changing and evolving. And we need to continually recognize that we're all engaged in learning organizations. It's not just that schools are in the business of learning. The school itself and the community itself is a learning organization. We are continually learning how to do schooling. And we can't do that alone, as I mentioned earlier, but we also need to engage and to actively manage that effort. I think far too often we have all these reports generated, and then we have a conference and we're all sort of motivated, and then it gets put away. We need to make that commitment to actively manage this work.
Thank you. So, Dr. Schultz, the U of M report and the Reimagine report talks about how the school leaders, the teachers, the people who are in school, how they must develop a level of self-reflection, critical cultural consciousness, and orienting towards the students and their family needs. You started this report several years ago. How has Edina Public Schools wrestled with this challenge in your growing diversity?
So when I started in Edina, I entered into a community that I was just excited to be there. I'm still excited to be there because they are, what Dr. Rodriguez just said, in a conversation about their schools. The community is there. It's every student. The expectation is that every student is engaged in their classrooms. There's an expectation that every student is engaged in their interests. Their student and their families are partners in the schools. And there are broader community partners that come into that conversation and support every student that comes into those buildings. And it is exciting to be in those conversations and be a leader for education. In our learning environments, we are working very hard in the restorative practices and discipline. We're working hard to build those inclusive communities in all of our classrooms where teachers have an understanding of who their students are, creating partnership with their students. Family and community engagement. You heard two of our students talk about the Mosaic group that has conversations about the cultures that are in the Edina Public Schools. One of the greatest images I have is in our lobby outside of our boardroom. We had a multilingual evening where parents come in, and what was so fun was all the parents were around the technology people watching how to use our Chromebooks and asking questions and learning how to access their students' work and their curriculum. The curriculum that we are promoting and using in Edina, we're asking the question in our curriculum specifically who benefits from the depiction of the history that our curriculum is teaching, and also asking the questions whose voice is missing in that depiction. Our teachers, we have coaches and groups that learn about the cultural and linguistic approaches to teaching that gives teachers the language and the methods to frame their instruction and curriculum. And we also give teachers technologies to house data and information about their students so that, as Dr. Rodriguez mentioned earlier, we can have partners with our students and know who our students are. Our leaders are working hard in understanding their own leadership through different inventories, setting goals around intercultural development. And we also work real hard to question our implicit biases and challenge one another. So it's exciting to have Reimagine Minnesota's recommendations and see them become alive in a school system. And in Edina, those conversations continue, they're expected, and it's just fun to watch this unfold.
Thank you. What I appreciate is how it shows that we can put this report to work and actually have outcomes. The interesting thing for me, one of the interesting things for me in this report was a shift from a concentration on equity of opportunity to a focus on equity of outcome. You know, when we talk about, and doing it through serving the student in their needs. You know, when we talk about equity of opportunity, imagine giving us two children, one of whom is a little malnourished and underfed, and one who's a little portly, and we give each child the same meal because same is equal and equal is same. But if instead we give each child what they need, that responds to how they came to us, we'll return to you two healthy children. And that's what that equity of outcome is about. And this report does something really remarkable that I've seen tried in other places. In New Mexico 25 years ago, there was an effort in a bill to say that you could not accredit a school if you could predict graduation rates by race or gender. And then one of the legislators read the report and it didn't pass. Here we're reading the report and writing it. Dr. Schultz, how do you react to the notion that we're going to work to ensure that you cannot predict how well a child performs based on her race, poverty, status, or zip code? What does results neutrality mean to you, and how do you react to it?
First of all, I like the way that you depicted that, in particular when it came to equity, and initially you were talking about what's equal for everyone. There's a large misperception of what does equity mean, and I do think that we need to have that at our tabletop discussions, because often when you mention things like equity or you mention things of cultural competence, individuals go straight to race. And I'm here to tell you that you can talk about race and not be racist, okay? But there are racist implications and systemic racism. When it's there, you have to call it out. And not calling it out is a problem, okay? But there's a historical context, even when Dr. King came here, 1963 and 1967, right at the height, right, of the civil rights movement. And we have to think about things in ways of what was going on then. I think as we began to talk about the issues of what's going on in our society, particularly as we're here today, wrestling with the educational issues and thinking about neutrality as is espoused by many, we have to go back and look simply. Myself, we have to talk about vision. We have to put the vision out there. What does it mean to have a real serious vision? What does it mean to talk about our current reality? What does it mean to talk about policy and practice? And the reason we have to talk about vision, because vision when? Now or then? Because as the Constitution was constructed, it had a vision, but did that vision clearly articulate access for everyone? And when we talked about the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration as it was laid out at that particular time in history, understanding the vision may have been beautiful for those who wrote it, but at that same time, there were individuals, African Americans in bondage, there were women without the rights to vote, individuals could not have property. If I were a white male and did not own property, I did not have the same access. And access itself leads to inadequateness amongst individuals who have access to the funding. So that leads us to our school system, and when we think about the reality now of where we are, and if we don't set policies that clearly articulate funding resources based upon who we have now, then we're going to continue to have inadequate funding. There are some realities between the Metro District, as pointed out by Dr. Alexander from the U, that talked about in the Metro, there's a 20 to 30% cost differential in the Metro just because of the labor costs. And if we get $1 in the Metro and you get $1, I'm going to say in some other place, that dollar in the Metro is like 70 cents versus the dollar that's really going to the rural. Then there's another issue that we haven't addressed. I think the legislators have tried to, but trying is really not going to get it. We're fundamentally flawed in that area. What we don't recognize the differences. We have a huge socio-emotional issue occurring right now, not just in our area, but throughout the nation. We have at-risk factors when you have a urban-suburban district, and you look right at Robbinsdale. We are that district that represent Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnetonka, all of them. And when you go to fund that district, you have to look at some of the causations as to how you're trying to educate all children. And it's clearly stated that all of us have these inalienable rights, okay? Well, you're taking away the rights if you're underfunding the school system. And I think right now, to get to neutrality, we have to go back and say, what are the real needs to fund these districts? And just by giving us the ability to do additional levies, then you're also discounting some districts who did not have the financial means to be able to do a levy. The They may have more businesses in one community than in another community. Then you put the tax burden on the people who can afford it the least. So I think getting to neutrality, there needs to be a deeper dive as to, are we going to live up to our Constitution here in Minnesota of having a uniform system that can educate all children.
Wonderful, thank you. And as we leave this room and have time to review the report in detail, I would point out that it has a strong section on the need to find financial solutions to this equity issue.
Dr. Alexander did a great job, and as a part of that report, what I did like about the report, her piece about the financial neutrality, but also what Dr. Khalifa did and talked about the cultural competence piece, because to do all the professional development that he spoke about, not just for teachers but administrators, you need funding to be able to do that, and more so because of the fact 94% of our teaching staff, they're white, 4% are people of color, and 33% of our students. The students stood up here and spoke about the psychology, the cultural differences. I said, that young man need to go write a report himself because he was spot on. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Jenkins, you alluded to some of the history that led to this system that doesn't serve all students. And this report also refers to it. It does a wonderful job, I think, of reframing how, and pointing out how after Brown v. Board, African American teachers were driven out of the profession.
Wow.
And closed out of education because integrated schools meant white parents didn't want to face a minority teacher for their student. Today, this report has reframed the issue from recruitment of teachers to an invitation to people to return to teaching and to create a hospitable environment for teachers. How do you take this report's response to recruitment and talent questions?
First of all, thank you for bringing that point out, because that was, in my estimation, a good start to illuminate that for our community of what happened historically. And the notion, when we started with Brown versus the Board of Education, there were some whites who didn't want their children being taught by African Americans, so they eliminated the African American teachers and administrators. And it was also very tough for board members to get elected during those times. Now, these are individuals who had just been deemed, and if you go back and look, I'm a history buff, at how African Americans have performed before they came to American. The African people have always been of the brightest people in the world. And then when we had segregated schools, you had high performance. You had, actually in the area of science and math, African Americans perform extremely well under the leadership of African American teachers, African American principals, African American board members. Once integration occurred, it was a concerted effort, which I must say to you, that's happening again right now as I speak. Okay, to eliminate teachers of color, eliminate administrators, eliminate superintendents, and to close out board members. So when I think about the report and how it began to lay out and say we need to start recruiting, the recruiting must reflect the philosophy of the individual and of the children that you're trying to serve. And those children need to, and all the research is pointed out in your report that talks about an African American child having one person of color increases their academic opportunities, the potential that they're going to even graduate. But it's not only good for the African American child, it's good for all children. But I will say it has to go forward because African American teachers need to have leaders in the building to see from a career standpoint, I start here, but I can go to the next level. I want to go from a teacher to being a superintendent. And when I finish, I want to volunteer my time and be a board member. So that's what I would say. But some of the strategies specifically, I would say in my 30-year career, I've worked inside and outside to build this capacity of understanding of recruiting individuals, looking at teacher licensures, what are they asking, particularly like in our state right now, as you look at the data which was reported out, that was real data in terms of getting people of color into the state on one level. So we have to also build bridges with historical black colleges and universities. I graduated myself from Mississippi Valley State University. a historical black college and university, which is a part of who I am right now and gives me another lens to complement my colleagues like Dr. Schultz.
Wonderful. So Dr. Schultz, as a colleague, how do you bring others along, and how do you help recruit and retain Indigenous and teachers of color, and how would you suggest we need to change at the superintendent's level in managing this?
So I think that this question leads to probably the most important work we can do in schools today. It's also the most difficult, as Dr. Jenkins alluded to. I think the thing that I've done in addressing this is really making sure that I listen to understand what the experience is of a teacher of color coming into a school system, and listen to what the needs are for the system to welcome them and to create an environment for them to achieve and to build relationships with students. So I've looked for these partnerships in my career as a superintendent. I had the opportunity to meet a business leader who recruited business leaders from historically black colleges and universities. And as I was talking to him, I just asked him one day, well, if you can recruit leaders and business leaders, could you recruit teachers? And we set out to begin to call the historically black colleges and universities presidents to ask them, how can we recruit teachers to Minnesota? We have a problem in Minnesota. It's called snow and cold. That really is difficult for individuals to say from the south, I'm going to go to the cold north. And so we found that challenging, but I think it's important for superintendents to listen for those opportunities. There are some wonderful opportunities that are happening in, I know the University of Minnesota has teacher of color programs, Metro State, St. Thomas. I think school districts need to become engaged and active with teacher preparation programs to provide a place for individuals to train and support. So for example, can school districts hire the student teachers as paraprofessionals, and as they are student teaching, support them economically? I think that's been something I've learned, that we can help them as a school system to provide them that economic resource. I think the other part was, once we get them in, probably the most part is to provide community. In Edina, we have affinity groups for our staff of color, and I meet with them. Our other leadership meets with them, the district administrators, principals, listens to their concerns, addresses their concerns, and really gives me the opportunity as a leader to listen to them to continue to build that community. So I also want to applaud the state of Minnesota's pursuit of this work, to put some resource behind it, but a lot more has to be done in listening and having conversations.
If I may add one other point in there too. Actually, one, there's a reality that we have 4% staff of color. They're not all, I'm a foreigner, I'm from Alabama. And so the cold, I've been here for over 30 years in the Midwest. So it's not just the weather, but it's the level of, once we get them here, as my colleague said, forming other partnerships. And some of it, not just within the school systems, we must educate our community, illuminate what's also happening. The level of microaggression that happens here in the state of Minnesota, you probably figured it out. I'm not Minnesota nice, okay? But the level of microaggression is serious. And what I want to say, it happens to students. Then it turns around and happens to our teachers. Then it happens to the administrators, superintendents, to the board members. If we're serious as a community, we should be outraged when we see situations like East Carver and someone's trying to step up and do the right thing. You see Edina wrestling with things as a community to fight those wars in isolation. That's not right. See, we can't talk about justice and be okay with injustice.
That's right.
And I just say in Robbinsdale, we've made a commitment to move forward. It started way before I got there. Robbinsdale was at the beginning over 48 years ago with early childhood. Robbinsdale has been a changing community. And Robertsdale School Board and community has stepped out and said, we're going to do some things, you know? And when it happens in Minnetonka or Anoka, as a community, as a state community, we have to stop allowing this to happen, a few individuals to run our good teachers, our good children, and our good families out of the state of Minnesota.
Thank you. Michael, I know you want to add something.
Yeah, just to jump on that, because I really appreciate you pointing this out. We have all these great opportunities, and we have some of them at the University of Minnesota to essentially grow your own kind of effort, urban teacher programs with real strong partnerships with schools. And we hear, and I know personally from a close friend who changed careers and decided to give back and went to work in a school in her own community where she grew up and where she raised her daughter, and was questioned regularly with regard to whether or not she had a real teaching license, and the only reason she was hired is because of affirmative action, and within a year left the school, very sadly. Heartbroken, because her kids finally said, we love our teacher because she's one of us, she knows us, and she's from our community. We have a resource in our schools, I think, that is often perhaps overutilized in some respects, but underutilized in a way that it could really be helpful. And it's a resource in our schools that could really help us, our schools and communities, understand how to be learning organizations, because they are about helping us understand how to do our work. And these are the research, evaluation, and assessment directors, our assessment coordinators in our schools. And I know we've got a number of them in the room, and I want you to stand up.
Yes.
Research, evaluation, and assessment staff. These folks are so dedicated, and they work so hard to help make sure that we know what we're doing in our schools and in our communities, and we really need to appreciate them. They help us be learning communities.
Thank you. So we have just a couple minutes left. This report talked about the power of bringing together cross-pollination, a broader view, bigger schools, statewide view, not just local. And today, we've brought together the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation, the United Way, and the Minneapolis Foundation to say we're watching and we want to help. We have representatives of DEED, people from Itasca. We have board members who are leaders in our community. We have the Attorney General's office. We have a very remarkable group of people gathered to say we want to be a part. Think about this fact, right? Schools, less than 180 days a year, less than half a year, 6 hours a day, less than a quarter of a child's day. You add it all together, children spend about 8.7% of their life in school before age 18. They spend another third sleeping, 3% eating, occasionally bathing. A lot of schools do an incredible job with 8.7% of a child's life. We've got to have the wraparound. The rest of the community has to show up. Could I ask Dr. Jenkins and Dr. Schultz to just take a minute to reflect, and really just a minute, on how you've valued the cross-pollination that went into this report and what we should look for next?
Well, first of all, much appreciation for the time that the scholar practitioners at the university took to weigh in on the work. I look forward to engaging with them more to get a little bit deeper on the action plans, taking action, not just conversation. But I have really appreciated not only there with the university, that piece, but with my colleagues. It has been the greatest experience for me, having been a superintendent in another state. This doesn't happen, that you get this many superintendents stay together for this long on a topic that we know can be controversial, but we also know that it can be life-changing for the entire state. So my appreciation in reality comes in the fact that I know and believe in my 30 years and having my teacher training at Mississippi Valley State University, having taught phys ed, having coached, and understanding Bandura's belief system and training model, that all individuals can too produce if given the right conditions. So in learning from my other colleagues what they're doing in their district, and knowing that we need to take these strategies to the next level. We as a district in Robbinsdale have worked with our unions, because it's important to know that too. You have to work with your unions as partners and come up with a memorandum of understanding to retain our teachers with certain skill sets in our district, be it people of color or specialty skills. So I have really appreciated just working together with my colleagues, who I think are phenomenal. And as Dr. Tucci Osori has said, we do fight. And you can probably imagine we have some intense discussions. You cannot go forward if you do not engage in intellectual exchange, and you don't have to agree, period.
Thank you. Dr. Schultz, any final reflection?
So I really echo what Dr. Jenkins said. I think this work is, when we started this work and I asked Paula the first question, and now it has been, this conversation has continued to the rest, to a broader audience. It's very rewarding. I want to thank everybody in this room for being part of this conversation. Thank all my colleagues. I want to thank all the school boards that wrestle with this. I still believe at this point in this work, we are still talking, we are still studying, but we still have students that are not connecting with what's happening in the classroom. And I think we need to begin to transform all this wonderful conversation, all these great ideas, and all the support into action. And want to continue to keep that as a focus.
Thank you. Dr. Rodriguez, you're good. Well then, I want to take a minute to say how much I appreciate your voice in moving us away from high-stakes testing, in which we seem to spend more time weighing our babies than we do feeding them, into testing which helps us inform the conversation and interaction with our students, so that we can, as this report suggests, eliminate adult behaviors that lead to disproportionality, create culturally responsive and inclusive schools, elevate our students' voices, create a common vision for personalized education that measures how each student succeeds, not where they fail, invest in strategies to recruit and retain our teachers of color and indigenous teachers, bridging schools, homes, and families. Education is a liberating force in human development. Once given, it cannot be taken away. It is one of the most powerful indicators of future success, and it is one of the greatest treasures that is transmitted intergenerationally. And we have failed in Minnesota to give that treasure and that power across generations. It is time for us to stop it now. This report tells us one way to start making that happen, and you, as our community, are the voices that will hold us responsible, accountable, and be the partners to make this vision a reality. I want to thank our panelists and thank our colleagues who are here today.
There's just a lot of people are kind of fed up, you know what I mean? Like, we've only been alive. Just the education system, systems in general, how they kind of don't work. Especially for people who look like me and you know what I mean? It's tough. I know, like, personally, I've been through like a lot with the education system. Like I have ADHD, ADD, anger issues, anxiety, depression, just big old ball. Yeah, and like I actually was in a special like reading class. I didn't even know it was like a special kind of, you know what I mean, situation where they had to like teach me how to read and write. And then now like I read at a college level and I write at like a college level, you know what I mean? So I've like had my ups and downs.
Good morning. Okay, technology. There we go. I want to express my gratitude to all of you for being here today and helping us really be a part of reimagining education in Minnesota. I'm John Wilgers. I'm the president and CEO of Greater Twin Cities United Way. And I want to say what an honor it's been for us to participate with everyone you've heard from today in this project, and especially to be partnering with the Minneapolis Foundation, the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation, and the university. So thank you for that opportunity. It's great to be here. This project didn't start from scratch, as you heard. It started from the work performed by a group of deeply engaged and dedicated educators who really came together to do just that, reimagine what education could be in Minnesota. And I think you've heard it a number of times, but I think it's important to highlight how the experiences and the input from parents and students and educators and community leaders and cultural representatives were all solicited and gathered as part of this project. Soliciting feedback from those most impacted is so important, and it's something that we do in all our work at United Way. As a member of my community impact team says, nothing about the community without the community, and that was so important to this project. Everybody has a reason for being here today, and I know that all of us share a responsibility in advancing this work. Probably you, like all of me, have been sitting out there thinking about what could my role be, what should my role be in carrying this forward, and I look out here and a number of people have said, what a big group, and this is a big group, and with this big group comes a lot of power to move this work forward. As we work individually and we work inside and with our organizations, we really on a collective basis have a great opportunity to do something special. So you're going to get your first chance at doing something special here in a few minutes. So when I'm done, which is pretty quick here, it'll be time for a break. We'll take around a brief 10 or 15 minute break, and then we invite you to return to your tables and have discussions around the topics that are highlighted in the report. Pick your topic. They're on the table tents, and we can start talking about the collective action that can come out of the experience that you've had here today. So again, on behalf of everybody that you've heard from today, thank you for being here, and enjoy the break, and we'll see you back at your tables.
I'm going to try the education tool. Put your hand in the air. All right, slowly. We're taking our seats. I see the hands. It's always good when people are talking, and that's what you're going to get to do for the next hour, so don't worry. Thank you for taking your seats. When we were planning this event, we wondered if we gave them a break, will 25% leave? Will half leave? Do we have to fear 3/4 leaving? And we were so wrong. You're all still here. This is fantastic. All right. Okay, let's get started. My name is Julie Schweitzer. I work at the University of Minnesota as the director of the College Readiness Consortium. And among other things, we've developed a college and career readiness curriculum called Ramp Up to Readiness, used in some of your schools and close to 150 across Minnesota and in a dozen other states. We work with U of M youth programs on incorporating more college readiness in their programs, and if you want to know where those are, go to a website called youthcentral.umn.edu. I've worked with Michael Rodriguez on a number of projects, including 2 big convenings we called Educational Equity in Action. I know some of you were at some of those convenings. And also helped partner with our faculty to produce the report that's here today. And finally, I spent 12 years on the St. Louis Park School Board, and part of that time on the AMSD, with AMSD as well. And I mention all of that because while I've been employed by the University of Minnesota for a long time, I've spent the last decade heavily connected with K-12. And if we're going to solve the educational equity issues that exist in K-12 and higher ed, we need even more partnerships like this and the many others that have been discussed today, and have them grow tighter. I'm also committed to action, and we trust you are too, and that's why you're here today. So we know the best ideas for action come out of our collective thought and working with each other. So now is the time for you to do that. We're going to have you meet at tables on issues of common concerns. So we're going to start that by having you pick one of the themes from the reports. They're on the screens to either side here, and they're on the tables. And they're in a logical order. You've got in your report, you've got all of the themes listed. The short titles are on the signs on the table. We have adult behaviors, that row of tables on the far left, recruitment and retention. No, I'm doing these in the backward order. Adult behaviors, cultural competence, student voice kind of right here ahead of me, personalized education, community bridges is the next row of tables, recruitment and retention, the next to last one, finance in the last row, and you may notice we're missing a theme, social emotional learning, and that's across the back. So pick one of those that you would like to talk about. Then we would like you to go to a table on that theme, and I think still start at the front and work back, because we want you to have a full table. And with this crowd, we're going to have multiple tables on each theme, and that's great, but we don't know how many for each theme. So you'll group better if you start at the front tables and move back. For social emotional learning, let's have you start on the left here and then work to the right. For our superintendents, if you would spread out among the tables, so we have no more than one superintendent at each table, that would be great, but fill up as many tables as we can. And for our faculty that are here, if you would pick one of the tables on one of the themes you contributed to. And we, I think, there were 6 or 7 faculty members that were here. Of course, some of them have teaching obligations and other commitments today, but many of them are here, and if you would sit at a table on one of the themes you worked on. Neither our superintendents or our faculty are meant to be the expert. We at the university are learning to move beyond that sage on a stage model. They are contributors to the conversation with one version of expertise, just as our students, our other school leaders, our board members, our community members, everybody who is represented here, all bring their critical knowledge to this conversation. Once you're at the table, we ask one person to volunteer to facilitate the conversation. I think we're going to have lots of talkers. I don't think it's going to be a challenge to get things going, but somebody who can just make sure everybody has a chance to be heard and to remind us on the questions that we are giving to you as a starting point for discussion. There is a facilitator guide, a piece of paper on the table, and if one person would take that responsibility, we'd appreciate it. If one person would volunteer to take notes, there's an especially large piece of paper on each table for you to take notes, and that'll give you lots of space, and we will gather those and compile those best as we can afterwards. Finally, we'll reconvene in about 25-30 minutes. We'll see how the conversations are going with a different kind of reporting out. Don't worry, we're not going to hear every table say what they did. We've got a new tool that some of you may have experienced, but I expect will be new to many others. And it's a way we can individually report out and commit to action. So if you have in mind right now the table that you're going to look for, in your brochure at your table, you have a very, very, very short summary of some of the ideas that the faculty members had on that topic, but you were given a link to the full report in your email from the Minneapolis Foundation. And start the conversation. And we hope that from this and from the collective ideas, you come up with at least one idea that you can commit to when you go back to your home place and find your next way to engage in improving educational equity in Minnesota. So with that, I turn it over to you, and we'll call you back in about 25 or 30 minutes. Good luck. All right, I get to interrupt you one more time. And I suspect you're all having great conversations because as we've walked through, we've heard that. But this is the time when you get to share that information. So I'll give you a minute to bring that conversation to a close. And for the note people to take your last notes on what you were discussing. Okay, if you could each individually think of one thing that you want to share with the group. Either the most important thing that you think we need to do, or better yet, what you are committing to do. So if you could wrap up the conversation so you can each think of your own idea, we'll explain the tool by which you can do that. Okay, how many of you have done Padlet before? And I know there should be more hands than that because a bunch of you have been doing Padlet already while you've been talking. Padlet is a wonderful tool that lets us do sort of virtual Post-it notes. I love the, I probably shouldn't use the trademark term, but with 3M in the world, our world, it's kind of nice to honor that visual impact. You all got an email this morning, and clearly some of you read it because you've already been participating. But if you look at the screen on the right or the email, and yes, you have permission to pull out your device, your phone, your tablet, your laptop, it works on all of those. There's a URL over on the right. And I'm sorry, but I did not memorize the URL, and I can't read it from here, and you probably can't either. All right, clue, it's the abbreviation for Minneapolis Foundation, MPLSFDN, MPLSFDN.org/Padlet, Padlet. If you go to that spot, you're going to get to the to this application, and then you'll find a plus in the right-hand corner, lower right-hand corner. Click on that, and it'll give you a little spot to type whatever you want, and what we'd like you to type is the action that you are committing to do as a result of your discussion today. So you want to make it short, but you want to make it helpful to others. And they have been appearing up on the screen on the left, and I'm going to go down here so I can read some of them. We've been slowly scrolling as more and more of them are entered, and there's a wide range. So many of you have contributed so far. The ones that are up there now are comments about how empowering it is to have people from different areas sitting around the table to dig into this effort. I think that's good guidance for going forward with your individual efforts. What are philanthropic, a question, what are philanthropic networks looking for related to this effort? Adding higher education and community colleges to this effort, absolutely. We need everybody involved in higher ed. We have our own equity issues that, again, can't be solved without working with K-12, as well as what we do on our own. Student voice, including students in decision making. Personalized education, that relationships are at the core, and relevant learning. I've seen a couple that relate to increasing emphasis on early childhood. Adult behavior, collaborating with leadership who are moving toward change. Instead of celebrating, I think of instead of just celebrating, collaborating with leadership. Adult behaviors, here's a commitment. I will actively dismantle systemic racism. If I don't, I'm supporting its existence. Yes. Somebody commits to working with principals to identify paraprofessionals of color and supporting their work. Increasing teacher voice in improvement efforts. Working on adding student voice to the middle school science curriculum review. Student voice, I missed that one, but here's another point. There's no fence to sit upon. You have to be on one side or the other. Elevate community voice using my leadership power to support this work. Here it is. Use my leadership power to elevate community voices that are not heard enough. I love the people that went beyond the directions and photographed, have the whole set of notes up there. I love all you that started putting up contributions to this before we even asked you to. This is a skilled and energetic group. Need to have parents and broader community participating in sessions like this, hiring more diverse staff and have a plan to support them. Increasing parent engagement. I think there's not a school out here that couldn't do more and better on parent engagement. Developing a framework and processing with students to support school leaders in elevating learning voice and developing leadership. Another person commits to share the results of the Minnesota Student Survey. Thank you for going, and what youth have told us about their social emotional skills and supports. Shout out to the U of M Youth Development Research Group. I'm pointing that one out because that's Michael Rodriguez's work. And it's all available on a website that you could Google and find, otherwise find Michael and he'll give you the direct link. Actively encouraging teachers of color to pursue leadership opportunities, creating more opportunities to shift consciousness around whiteness and power, starting with the top levels of system, using my influence to bridge community and schools, working with the greater Minnesota voice, making sure that they are included in this discussion, which has largely been in the broad metro area, broadly defined. Personalized education, talking about global and comprehensive perspectives. There are a zillion options up here, and I can't read them all, and unless your eyes are tremendously better than mine, which is quite possible, most of you can't read them either, all of them. But trust the Minneapolis Foundation staff is going to work to compile everything that was submitted on Padlet, and put it together with the notes and everything else we've done. So watch your email over the next number of weeks, and there will be a follow-up. They will be providing all of that information, the wonderful visual recording of what we're doing, or what we've done rather today, and sharing that with you, and working with all of us to figure out where we take this. I know in this world there's so much to do. You try and figure out, well, should I do that one or that one or that one first? And the answer is always, well, we need to do all of that. But what we can each do is one thing, start with one thing. And so find that one thing that you're going to start doing when you go back to your school, your community role, your higher ed role, whatever it is, and start working on that. And with that, for the final words, I'm going to turn it back to RT, to thanks to him and his staff for putting this together, to the Greater Twin Cities United Way and the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation.
Thank you, Julie. We really, really appreciate that. And we especially appreciate all of you staying here. We're going to let you out in just 2 minutes, but I want to you to wait because we have one final thing we're going to ask you to do to help move this forward. On behalf of my partners in this, John Wilgers of the United Way is back there, Dr. Eric Jolly from the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundations. I just want to thank our teams who did so much to put this together. The leader on that whole effort was Patrice Relaford, who leads education at the Minneapolis Foundation, who has been the guiding light on all of this and has done a tremendous job. What we'd like to do is to answer the question, what next? Now, what I want you to do as you do that is ask not what Reimagine can do for you, ask what you can do for Reimagine. That's a whole way of saying, if you ask me what's going to do next, I would say, beats the hell out of me. That's actually not quite true, but the fact of the matter is, none of us should assume that we can wrap this up in a pretty bow. What we should assume that if this is more of a movement than a report and a convening, then each of us has the power to do something. There will, let me assure you, be very rigorous look at what came in there, what you talked about at your table, all the feedback, and we will do everything humanly possible to put this together to continue the feedback loops we've had. Now remember, this started with superintendents turning to the community to find these areas that we're looking at in this report. That comes from the people who we all serve. The superintendents took that, made that better. The University of Minnesota built that research into it. The youth convening built on top of that what happened with Youth Voice. You are now building on top of that. In the back of the room, I was talking with one school board chair and the head of the Minnesota School Board Associations, and we said, well, maybe we should also add on a layer, and I know there are some school board members in the room, but a unique convening of them. That's one of the things we can do. You can each go back into your own communities and do this in your own way so that you can localize this work. And more important, how do we cross boundaries that are usually so difficult to cross? You see the Minneapolis Foundation, the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundations United Way working together. There are a lot of other coalitions that can be built as well. So toward that end, the final thing that we're going to ask you to do is to stand up, okay? You could stand up, and as you stand up, I want you to look around the room, and I want every single person here before you leave this room to identify one person in this room who can help you move forward one thing that you've learned today that you want to make happen. And if you don't have that one thing, go meet a stranger and figure it out. You're going to get an email talking about what the macro points we're going to do in all of this, but this is your responsibility, every person in this room, because we have the capacity to get this done. Having worked in education equity for many years, I honestly believe that we do not think we can solve this problem. We can, and we have the capacity to do that, but each of us has to take a responsibility. So find your first partner, make a commitment, exchange cards, text, I don't know, whatever you do, hug each other, make a partner, get something done. You're going to hear from us again, but we want to hear from you on what you will do next. Thank you so much for being here, and we will see you later.